Ludmilla's borrowed manor in the city was still the only one with Death Knights standing guard, though she supposed that the short time she had been away was too soon to expect any visible change. As they approached the gate to the manor, Amelia spoke. "A moment please, my lady," she said, coming to a stop in front of one of the Death Knights. "I should go ahead and let the others know of your arrival." The maid looked up at the Death Knight expectantly, but when it made no movement, she let out her breath in a half. She chose two of the spikes protruding from its armor to hang their baggage from and walked between them to the manor entrance, muttering to herself. After the door closed behind her, the Death Knight looked down at the bags hanging off of its armor. Footmen are supposed to help with baggage and other heavy articles, Ludmilla offered helpfully, as well as open doors and valet guests. They are also expected to keep the property outside of the manor swept and clean, so you too may want to see to that before the maids come out to harass you about it. The Death Knight wordlessly took the bags into its hand. Several minutes passed before the door of the manor once again opened, and the three maids that had remained in Erantle lined up along the lane to the entrance while Amelia once again took her place behind her. Ludmilla stepped onto the lane and the row of maids curtsied. "Welcome back, my lady," they said in unison. Terra rose to address her as she walked past them into the manor. "We did not expect your return so soon, my lady," her housekeeper apologized. "I thought you should have just arrived in your domain today." "You are not mistaken, Mrs. Roach," Ludmilla replied. "Originally, I stated that it would take about this long. Our journey upriver was a full day faster than expected, and we were transported back to the city this evening through magical means. We shouldn't be staying for more than a day. There are just some additional things that need to be done before we return to the barony." The manor was significantly cleaner than when she had left it, but the damage to the hall had still not been repaired. Everywhere else, the dust had been swept away and the floors and fixtures polished to a dull gleam. A trace of the scent purchased from Linez lingered in the air. "Will you be taking your evening meal here, my lady?" Terra asked before Ludmilla ascended to her solar. "Yes," she replied, then paused her steps. "Has there been any response to the staff requests I left with you?" "Surprisingly, there have. But no cook yet. You'll have to suffer my food for a bit longer, my lady." "I did not mean it in that way, Mrs. Roach," Ludmilla smiled slightly. "I rather enjoy your meals." After the Death Knight dropped off the baggage in her solar, she bathed and changed into a fresh white chemise, covering herself with a dark green robe that Amelia had picked out in Corlin village. The woolen fabric was sturdy and comfortable, and she had to agree that it was more practical to wear about the manor than just a smock or being fully dressed as she had thought of doing before. Her maid had even found a pair of matching slippers to use indoors. Leaving her solar to pass the time before dinner on the main floor, Ludmilla found the Lynham sisters waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs. "The dining room is ready to be used, my lady." Between the two, Loluvian was the one to speak as usual. "Dinner is nearly ready." Ludmilla had spent so little time actually living in the manor that she had forgotten there was a dining room. On the night that she had first looked around, the dusty room's furniture had been draped with cloth and put away in a corner, so she had decided against using it. The sisters led her around the courtyard and she found that the room was now cleaned and well lit. There was a long mahogany dining table lined with chairs carved with the flowing designs seen elsewhere in the manor. At the head of the table, a seat had been prepared, dishes and utensils laid out for her use. She seated herself and continued looking over the lavish setting, feeling entirely out of place. The guest manners were meant to impress the hospitality of the city on visiting nobles and dignitaries, so she supposed that it shouldn't have been a surprise to see such finery on display. The plates and bowls were fashioned out of jade porcelain and there were a half-dozen silver utensils laid out on a pure white cloth. 2 silver candle stands placed equidistant from one another on the dining table each held 3 lit beeswax candles. The candles themselves lent very little in terms of additional lighting, so it seemed wastefully extravagant to Ludmilla, whose manor in Warden's Vale used 2 old oil lamps and a small cook fire. Amelia appeared a short while later, replacing Willuvian who had stayed in the dining room to attend to her. Willuvian left the room and returned shortly after with her sister and Terra. The sisters each held a tray, one with her meal and the other with a tea set, and Terra led the small procession with a set of linen towel napkins draped over her arm. Ludmilla watched as they laid out dinner on the table. It almost seemed a ceremony with how focused each of her maids looked as they worked. Her meal was a combination of the food that she had dropped off earlier in the week and the bread and meats that we used to prepare her meals while she traveled. The tubers were roasted, and a thin, spicy soup had been made from the watercress. You have my apologies if there is a lack of flavor. Tara lowered her head as Ludmilla sampled the meal. There have been no merchants selling spices or condiments, well, no merchants at all, actually. Meals will be rather plain until they return. The meal seemed fine to her. Each ingredient had its own distinct taste and texture, so it wasn't as if the food was bland. With the ingredients that had been included, it seemed a rather fancy variation on her regular meals rather than the substandard fare Tara suggested it might be. She worked through a quarter of it before slowing down to speak to her housekeeper. You said there have been responses to the requests you put out? Ludmilla asked Tara after she washed down a portion of her meal with some sort of red tea. Yes, my lady, the housekeeper replied. I have not been able to see the head maid in the city. She is strangely hard to meet with, for household staff, but we've received a small handful of replies for tenants. Ludmilla thought that the head maid would be the easiest to get a hold of, as she was said to be training new maids in the central district. Perhaps it would have been easier to go through Yuri Alpha, who was the one to deliver her staff on the first evening that she had arrived in the city. The first was a strange man that came personally to the manor to inquire about tenancy as a farmer, Tara continued. His odd appearance aside, I am not sure how a common farmer could bravely make their way through the gauntlet of undead in the streets to the central district just to ask. A strange man, with an odd appearance? Yes, my lady, Tara nodded. He seemed less frightened than one would expect and more, excited? Maybe a bit too excited. I am not sure how to describe it, exactly. You may want to see him for yourself, maybe with one of the footmen, to be safe. He left his address with us. I will pay him a visit when I am out in the city tomorrow, Ludmilla said. Who else was there? The Merchant Guild sent us a notice. Several woodcutters and most notably a smith. I believe you've placed a priority on finding one. Really? Ludmilla's ears perked up at her words. That's a pleasant surprise. Was there any mention as to what sort of smith, or why they came forward? There were no details, my lady, Tara shrugged. It was a simple note delivered by a very frightened-looking courier from the guild. I see. Was there anything else? No, my lady. It has been otherwise uneventful here. We're running out of things to do in the manor, though the hall still needs repairs whenever we can find the people for it. How is the city, then? With the official business out of the way, Tara assumed a more relaxed posture and Ludmilla resumed her meal. I've seen very little change from when you left, my lady, she said. For the past day or so we've been fairly busy cleaning up the manor and making it livable, but I haven't noticed anyone in the streets from the windows and I have not been out of the manor. Well, there must be some people moving about, considering what we've received from the Merchant Guild. The Lynham sisters have gotten brave enough to check the letterbox behind the Death Knights in the front, and I still don't dare give those two footmen any sort of instructions. Speaking of which, Ludmilla said as her housekeeper's words brought the topic to mind, we've been experimenting with using undead as labor out in the domain. Even Lutzi was able to employ a group of them to help with village upkeep. Surely you jest, my lady. Tara started with a laugh but, after noticing Amelia's somewhat proud expression to the side, the smile fell off of her face. Wait, you're serious? I am, Ludmilla nodded. Lutzi has been quite successful at it, so we thought that we could reduce the amount of junior staff required for menial labor and simply have a handful of household staff directing the undead. It would result in better accommodations for the staff that we do take on and cut down on manor upkeep. The housekeeper's gaze turned inwards with a grim expression. Whether she was considering the utility of the undead or just the idea of sharing the same space as them, Ludmilla was not sure. So all that would remain are the senior staff, chambermaids and the kitchen staff? Tara asked. You are the housekeeper, Mrs. Roach, Ludmilla told her, so I will leave how things are arranged in your hands. You will probably have to investigate their usefulness at various tasks before settling on what is appropriate. I am entirely uncertain how well undead labor will handle kitchen duties. The cook will need to determine this whenever we finally have one. Also, I suspect that attending to guests will mostly still rely on human staff, so household duties may be a bit unconventional compared to how things would usually be. If we're able to reduce our staffing needs by 3/4, Tara said carefully, it certainly seems like it would make hiring a much more simple matter. If Lutzi has already approved of their use, they should at least meet the standards required of junior staff for regular household labor. We would have to find those willing to work with the undead on a permanent basis, though. As you have mentioned, Mrs. Roach, we will not need many more. I am also of the mind that we should only be hiring those who can work with the undead, given the new realities of the realm. Ludmilla glanced at the Lionum sisters. If Wiluvian and Leluvian fill positions as chambermaids, I'm not even sure if we need any more maids for the city. Between them, they can direct 8 undead laborers to handle menial chores all around the manor. Direct, my lady. Leluvian abruptly spoke after hearing Ludmilla's words. You mean they won't just work on their own? Tara shot a reprimanding glance at the half-elf maid for speaking out of turn, but Ludmilla waved away her concerns. Skeletons, at least, need some sort of direction, Ludmilla answered. Their actions are also dependent on the instructions of their handler, so, ultimately, the results of their work will rely on your ability to convey your own expertise through them. Lutzi has spent most of the day with her own group cleaning up the village, so she can explain much better than I could on how they can be applied to your duties. Following her words, the room was quiet until Ludmilla finished her meal. Placing her utensils and napkin aside, she rose from the table. I will be working in my solar, she said. It will be another long day tomorrow, so I will not need anything further for tonight. The following morning, Ludmilla left early with her lady's maid and brought one of her footmen to accompany them. Now familiar with procedures, she was able to make her requests at the civil office and be on her way within a half hour. There were a few differences from her original request, based on the news that she would actually be welcoming new tenants and from what she had learned on the field the previous day. The 3 new farming teams were each composed of 80 skeletons, 20 bone vultures and 2 pairs of death knights to operate the heavier equipment. Ludmilla had originally intended to use the bone vultures and undead beasts for other work, but the flying undead had proven surprisingly useful for efficiently transporting small loads to and from the fields, saving precious time as she worked to not fall even further behind in the planting season. She would take the undead beasts and half of the bone vultures already working in the barony to test out what they had been originally intended for. Additionally, she had requested 40 more skeletons and 3 death knights, unsure exactly how many each of her new woodcutters could manage. As an afterthought, she filled out a request for 4 skeletons to be evaluated in the city manor while she was away. There was no official form for it, but between the elder liches at the counter and herself, they managed to draw up a miscellaneous request. When the undead arrived in front of the office for inspection, they filled the entire avenue with their neatly formed ranks. Rather than having them wait in the military district once again, Ludmilla had them follow her wagon out into the city. She had given the Soul Eater operating the wagon instructions to drive to Mesmit's forge, and it had trotted off immediately. She wasn't sure if it was the same Soul Eater as before or it simply knew what she was referring to somehow. Needless to say, the passage of the wagon followed by a column of hundreds of undead made quite the racket. Looking up, Ludmilla saw people peeking out of the windows of their homes, staring wide-eyed as they passed below in the streets. Doesn't it seem like we're leading an army through the street, my lady? Ludmilla did not think that there was much of a difference, especially considering that most came with their weapons. It basically is, she replied. This should become a common sight soon, I think, as long as the nobles have to move large numbers of undead laborers from the city to their territories. This might actually become a problem. Nobles with large territories will disrupt city life with thousands of undead laborers running around like this. I don't know where they are keeping them all, but they'll need to stop having the laborers present themselves in the central district every time someone's request is approved. As they made their way through to the eastern quarter of the city, the scene continued repeating itself. She imagined all the people that would normally be using the streets, heading to and from their places of work, transporting goods and driving carts and wagons. It would definitely be a bad idea to march this many undead around when the city returned to normal, blocking traffic and interfering with business. She squeezed the undead column into the alley leading to the back gate of Mesmit's forge to get them off of the main street. The Soul Eater parked the wagon near the storefront and the sound of chimes accompanied their entrance to the shop. The shopkeeper raised his head at the sound and stepped out from behind the counter, bobbing his head in greeting. Welcome, Baroness. His eyes briefly went from Ludmilla to her maid, then scanned for any additional visitors before returning to her. How may we assist you today? I have a need for more equipment. She held out her order as she replied. Do you still have inventory left for purchase? Indeed we do, my lady, the shopkeeper said as he received the sheet of paper. We haven't had anyone else come by since your visit a few days ago. He looked down at the order form, which used the template provided by the Merchant Guild. His eyebrows raised momentarily, then drew down as he tilted his head silently. Is there a problem with the order? Ludmilla said after the silence stretched on for several moments. No, my lady. He looked back up to her and replied. We are more than happy to fill your order. The problem lies elsewhere. The shopkeeper opened the back door and gestured for them to follow as he voiced his thoughts. Your purchase will clear space in the warehouse so we can continue dealing with all these abandoned orders of spears. Our forge master. He interrupted his explanation when the muscular frame of Isbrunt Mesmit appeared to fill the corridor before them. Baroness Zaradnik has come to make another purchase. The forge master took the order form and made a gruff HPMH noise after glancing over it. Looks like you're getting pretty ambitious here, Baroness, he said as they continued on their way. Too bad we can't take advantage of most of the space you'll be freeing up. I was just explaining that, Forge Master, the shopkeeper said. While we have thousands of weapons left to cast into tools, we're going to run out of fuel soon. Sounds about right, Isbrunt affirmed. Since charcoal is produced in the duchy, we usually don't need to stock a whole lot. But shipments have stopped, just like this whole damn city has stopped, since the territory was annexed. What about the city warehouses? Ludmilla suggested. The central administration has been keeping the citizens supplied. I do not think they would mind selling you some of their stores, considering your purpose. I asked when the lady that you were with the other day came around to distribute food and sundries to the neighborhood yesterday, the forge master replied. Most of what the city has is firewood, which doesn't burn hot enough for our work. We can't exactly turn it to charcoal in the middle of the city either. The bit of coal and charcoal that they do have isn't anywhere near enough to keep us running. If the territories producing charcoal don't start shipping soon, the city forges will go cold within a week of restarting operations. I see. Ludmilla recognized it as an appeal from the taciturn man. I will visit Countess Jesn later today and ask if there is anything she can do. That would definitely fix our problem, Baroness. His voice tightened as he pulled the main warehouse door open, at least this particular one. I didn't know why you had me keep the storefront open back when you asked. But I feel pretty stupid for letting everything that's happened blind me to running my own damn business. It's easy to take for granted when things are normal, but when even one piece is missing everything else grinds to a halt. You are not alone in this, Forge Master, Ludmilla said. We are fortunate that His Majesty is possessed of both the grace and wisdom to provide for us in this time of transition. I guess that's true, the Forge Master admitted. If this sort of thing happened in Reistais, who knows what would have happened. Maybe they'd have sent armed men into the streets to try and force us back to work. Isbrunt moved to open the gate to the yard, but stopped when he saw the hundreds of undead standing in the alley. The hell? Ludmilla hid her smile at the gruff man's reaction. Worry not, Forge Master, she said from behind him. They are not here to force you to do anything. I brought my laborers along this time to pick up their equipment. In hindsight, however, it is probably not such a good idea to block the road with them. You're using undead to farm? Isbrunt said dubiously. Is that even safe? I have just started testing them out in the fields, but their performance so far has been promising, enough that I am quadrupling the amount of labor to speed things along. They will come in to pick up what they have been ordered to retrieve, so your employees can continue working without interruption. Heeding Nonna's advice on her abilities, Ludmilla was experimenting with how well these undead could carry out her orders. Before they had arrived, she stood on the wagon bed and issued a chain of orders to the column of laborers following her. Both Lady Shiltir and Nonna had stated they could only follow simple instructions normally, so she wanted to test her ability to command relative to that basic outline. All there was to be seen now was how well the orders held. The Forge Master opened the gate, standing back as the undead walked in single file to pick up their tools from the warehouse. The first step was working so far. The skeletons came in, picked up their tools and walked back out of the gate. When the tools within easy reach ran out, They used each other as makeshift ladders to take equipment from higher shelves. This was not something she had specifically instructed them to do. The descriptions that she had heard about their capacity to follow instructions was very general, so she did not use any contingency orders to see how they would go about completing their tasks. Watching the outbound line file out of the yard, Ludmilla hoped that they would make it all the way to their next destination, which was back in the central district. She spaced the Death Knights, who were intelligent enough to be able to follow all of her instructions, at even intervals between the skeleton laborers. If the limit of her ability happened somewhere along the way, they were to round up the lost undead and take command of their respective formations, marching them the rest of the way themselves. That easy, huh? The Forge Master had his arms crossed over his chest, warily watching the orderly procession. His shopkeeper nervously stood beside him as the undead passed by, shrinking behind his boss every time a Death Knight came close. "I've had a bit of practice," she replied. Ludmilla did not want to boast about her own ability, but what came out instead made it sound like anyone could learn how to command vast numbers of undead servants with this degree of complexity, which was probably not the case. She tried to expand on what she had carelessly said. "I think anyone that has experience directing large groups of people should be able to do this." "You're saying I could do the same?" Isbrand laughed. "I got 8 journeymen working under me. Does that mean I can boss 8 of these undead around?" "My maid has been ordering around 4 of them all of yesterday." She looked to Amelia, "so I would say at least that many should be a reasonable expectation. You could use the undead to assist you, and each of your journeymen should be able to do so as well." Ludmilla looked across the yard to where Isbrandt's employees were working to see if she could figure out an example for their use. "The skeletons can only perform straightforward tasks," she said, "so pumping bellows, cleaning the workshop and helping to move things around would be among the things they should be able to do without much difficulty. What they can do beyond that would be subject to your own imagination and skills, as I have little knowledge about your trade. You would need to figure out how many you actually need to keep up with each person's work. Maybe just 1 or 2 is enough, but it still means that you would go from having 2 or 3 of your employees working on a single project to each one of them working on their own." The Forge Master scratched his chin with a thoughtful expression on his face. When Ludmilla had initially gone through her own calculations, her imagination had run off with her entirely and nothing had worked out exactly as planned thus far. Isbrandt seemed like a much more level-headed person than she was, though. But that's crazy," the shopkeeper exclaimed. He appeared to have digested her words as well. "Any fool can see that," snapped Isbrandt. "You said they can do this for any simple labor?" "As far as I have seen, yes," Ludmilla said. "There are stronger, more intelligent undead like the Death Knights available, but I am not sure if it is worth having them just to handle heavy loads. Most of your labor seems to be tied up doing lighter work." "So what's the downside?" "As long as the demand for your work outpaces your capacity to provide it," Ludmilla said, "there should be no direct downside. Even the skeletal laborers on the lower end of the leasing schedule do not get tired, do not need food or sleep and follow instructions precisely as long as they are capable of carrying them out. They do not become excited or depressed, nor do they complain. Well, I had one that complained, but it was because he thought he lacked work to do." "And the cost?" "The ones I have for agriculture are rented out for 1/10 of the harvest. If I have it right, it comes out to being less than what it costs to support a single tenant farmer for an equivalent amount of time. If they maintain that rate for other forms of labor, it would be far cheaper than having a skilled worker doing menial tasks." "I get that," Isbrandt said as he watched the undead who had emptied out most of the warehouse. "Everything will change if what you say pans out, am I right?" "For better or worse," Ludmilla said in a subdued voice. "Each noble and business will have to decide how to incorporate this new source of cheap labor. Hopefully, they are not tempted to just put their human laborers out into the street in favor of the undead. If that happens, there will be a lot of people looking for work all at once. But, sooner or later Rantle will become many times more prosperous than it has ever been, especially if you only consider things purely in terms of productivity." The last pair of Death Knights walked out with their plow and the Forge Master locked the warehouse and the gate up behind them. He led them back out to the storefront. "Well, once I get my fuel issues fixed," he said, "I guess I'll see what this is all about." While they were waiting for the shopkeeper to settle the bill, The sound of the door chimes turned their heads. A large man stormed in. He was similar in disposition and frame as Isbrant, so Ludmilla assumed it was one of the other smiths in the quarter, and immediately started shouting when his eyes found him. Mesmet! You're alive! I saw all those undead come in and run off with your inventory. Were you just robbed? I knew that those things would be up to no good eventually. You coward, Isbrant shouted back angrily. Did you really just wait till they all left? Were you coming to see if I was alive, or did you come to dance on my corpse? As they shouted back and forth across the length of the store, Ludmilla wanted to cover her ears, especially with the forge master standing right beside her. Did they always yell at each other like this? Anyways, you're dead wrong, hey, Isbrant chuckled at his own words. The lady here just cleaned out my warehouse. What? The response rolled over them like a shockwave. Ludmilla wondered if this man or Germaine Linez was louder. Oh. Seeing Ludmilla and her maid, the man at the door removed the cap from his head and did something that she thought might have been a bow. He turned back to his exchange with Isbrant Mesmet. Why didn't you say anything, you greedy ass? Bullshit. Isbrant returned. It's your own damn fault for closing shop. Sell me your charcoal too since you're not using it anyways. Like hell I will. The other smith turned to Ludmilla. Since this guy's burned himself out, you should drop B. Here's the bill, Baroness. Isbrant pushed the stamped sheet into Ludmilla's hands and guided his clients out past the other smith. You should get out of here before he tries to sell you some crap you don't even need. Make sure you let Countess Jesn know we need her charcoal. The two women quickly found themselves out on the street, and the sounds of shouting continued to come through the door of the shop even as the Soul Eater rolled the wagon away. The Soul Eater brought them back to the manor, parking its wagon in the service road behind the building. On the way, Ludmilla was relieved to see that all of the undead had made it back to the avenue in front of the civil office. As the wagon rolled by, she issued orders for the new laborers to stand by near the villa gardens. She still needed to drop by the Merchant Guild to drop off the forger's invoice and look into the notices that were delivered while she was away. There was also the strange man that had come to visit the manor claiming to be a farmer. She wanted to visit Baroness Corlin as well to let her know that her village was waiting for her return, and Countess Jesn needed to know that the city needed her domain's exports of fuel. It was a moderately long list of things to do, but there would be a few hours left before the time she had agreed to meet with Lady Shiltier, just before the daily meeting of the royal court. Ludmilla thought about paying Germaine Linez a visit, but she still hadn't come up with anything substantial to entice her with. Following a quick lunch at the manor, Ludmilla decided to stop by and visit Baroness Corlin first. Clara came to answer much more quickly this time, opening the door with only a hint of hesitation. Ludmilla? Clara Corlin said with a puzzled look on her face. Didn't you just leave for Warden's Vale a few days ago? I did, she replied. I came back for a day to see to some things, but I'll be headed out again this evening. Lady Shiltier has graciously helped us get to and fro. I see. Clara's tone suggested that she did not get what Ludmilla meant at all. Well, we've just finished lunch, would you like to come in? Thank you, Clara, Ludmilla replied, but I still have to drop by Countess Jesn's manor before heading out into the city. How is Baron Hamel doing? He goes back and forth now, Lady Corlin said. We still take meals together. He can't cook at all, but at least I can cobble together something passable for us. Did you see about getting new manor staff? You're going to be too busy to do that sort of thing sooner or later. I've tried. A hint of exasperation entered Clara's voice. That headmaid is nowhere to be found. We've been instructed to see her for our staffing needs, but she's never available. It's almost as if she's actively avoiding us. This was the second time today Ludmilla had heard of the difficulties revolving around the headmaid in Rantel. Why did this mysterious person even exist if she couldn't even perform her duties? Have you checked with Miss Alpha? Ludmilla suggested. When I first arrived, she was the one who introduced me to my current household staff. The royal maid? Clara frowned. That hardly seems appropriate. The royal household should be attending to His Majesty. They shouldn't need to chase around the Central District's support staff. Clara was correct. There was absolutely no need for the royal household to be doing what Ludmilla had suggested. Lutzi, Ludmilla addressed her lady's maid. Do you know anything about this head maid? Yes, my lady, Amelia nodded. Tswerninia, The head maiden Eranthal was responsible for training the four of us, and she was training more staff besides. I admit it is an unheard of position. Eranthal has had no such office before now. Development of household staff is usually part of a housekeeper or butler's duties. What her maid said was in line with the common knowledge of the region. While temporary hired help might receive training from outsiders, professional households were usually trained internally as a matter of necessity. Ludmilla had no complaints about the four maids who had joined her household, but it was still an unconventional arrangement. "What is she like?" Ludmilla asked. "She is a bit older than I am, I think," Amelia answered after thinking for a moment, "but she is extremely strict. It was almost like she had it out for us even after we passed our evaluations. Miss Alpha seemed to be concerned about it as she monitored our progress. Swenania seemed to be much softer on the Lynham sisters, though I cannot figure out why that is." From what Ludmilla had experienced so far, the Sorceress Kingdom was run by mostly austere individuals. She couldn't imagine them allowing anyone to play favorites like that, but perhaps she only thought this because her exposure to their side was limited to Lady Sholtier, Yuri Alpha and the undead servitors. She thought about sending the Lynham sisters to go see the head maid, but it probably wouldn't immediately help Baroness Corlin. "What about bringing some of the household staff from your territory?" Ludmilla offered an alternative. "When I left the other day, it looked like things were returning back to normal in your village." "Is that so? That would be the best option, I suppose." Clara's voice trailed off for a moment. "I'll have to see about hiring a carriage. I was already in the city when everything happened, and usual ones don't appear to be available right now." "I hired a wagon from the city warehouse to get to the harbor," Ludmilla told her. "They're free to use for the time being." "That would work. How did you call for one?" "They can be requested from the civil office," Ludmilla replied. "I believe that any regular business you have directly with the Sorceress Kingdom is being funneled through there." "So business as usual, then," Clara nodded slowly. "Did you encounter any difficulties when you went there?" "Lord Rettenmeier and all of the people under him ran off, so there must be quite a few things to get used to for the new administrative staff. There are many new systems in place. They've done away with most of the old procedures entirely. Fortunately, there are manuals provided with the new materials and the paperwork is easy to get used to. The clerks will do their best to answer any questions you have as well. The office never closes, so you can visit at your leisure." "It never closes?" Clara tilted her head. "How does that work? When do they sleep?" "They don't. The entire office is staffed by His Majesty's servants." Lady Corlin paled, her eyes widening. "You just calmly walked in and filled out paperwork in front of a horde of undead?" "Well, I filled them out the night before after studying the new systems, but I did spend some time in the office in order to have things clarified. It was a bit before I came to visit the other day." "Ludmilla," Clara cried in a distraught voice, "you know I can't handle that. I'm not some frontier noble that bathes in the blood of demi-humans every day." "I what?" Clara half closed her door to peek out from behind it. "You know what I mean. I can barely leave this manor for fear of the undead." Ludmilla pushed open the door again. "The undead won't be going away at any point in the foreseeable future," she told her, "so you should get used to them already. Your tenants are already getting back to work. The rate you're going at here, they'll be drinking away all of your taxes." Lady Corlin pouted, making a dissatisfied sound. Her barony was one of the wealthiest territories in the duchy due to its place straddling a length of the fertile Katza River Valley. Ludmilla's sales from a few days ago were a pittance in comparison. Clara's face brightened again as she thought of an idea. "How about we go together then?" she asked, "just this once. I'll waive your harbor fees the next time you drop by." "If it's fear of the undead that's keeping you from visiting the civil office," Ludmilla answered, "I'm afraid that it would only be a short-term solution. The wagon you'll be leasing is drawn by an undead horse, and all of the assistance that they offer for security and labor is also undead." The hopeful expression was dashed off of Clara's face with Ludmilla's straightforward statement. Maybe she was being too blunt again. "I've been employing the undead for a few days now," Ludmilla made an attempt at reassuring her crestfallen friend, "both within the city and out in Warden's Vale. There have been no outstanding issues so far and, the way I see it, their use will be commonplace eventually. I'm trying to help you get ahead since we've been good friends for as long as I can remember, and our families have always been allies. Your domain is waiting for you, and Baron Vintner's lands across the highway look to have been abandoned. If you move to demonstrate your capabilities, His Majesty may grant you Vintner's title as well. The idea that she could effectively double the size of her holdings seemed to have some effect. Ludmilla knew that Clara was not a greedy woman, but any capable noble would leap at the opportunity to further put their skills to use and expand their domain. A minute passed before the calculating look passed from her face. "Do you think that's actually possible?" she asked. "As I understand it," Ludmilla said, "the administration's priority is getting things back to normal again. They would be ecstatic if a noble of your caliber returned to her duties and, considering how absurdly powerful the Sorceress Kingdom is, they have no reason to fear you becoming any kind of threat. Just don't become a repeat of Count Facet." Ludmilla's expression of confidence was in no way an exaggeration. Clara Corlin was nothing short of a genius and, when it came to noble matters, she was someone who knew no peer. Most of Ludmilla's extended knowledge concerning administration, diplomacy and economics stemmed from her long relationship with her childhood friend. Under the auspices of the Sorceress Kingdom, Ludmilla thought Clara's future seemed limitless, that is, if she could only be prodded out of her fearfulness. "You found out what happened to him?" Clara frowned at the mention of Count Facet. "We were informed that he had been disposed of for overstepping his bounds, but they left it on that very vague and ominous note." Ludmilla shared what she had learned about the late Count from Lady Schultier. "That greasy old fox finally went too far." Clara's satisfied-sounding voice did not even show a hint of remorse for the man. "You know, after we heard that the royal army had been decisively defeated at Katza, we started making bets behind his back about whether the bloody emperor would purge him. It's a good thing that the Sorceress Kingdom could see him for what he was as well." Her friend's posture had relaxed quite a bit and her tone had reverted to one that was more suited to casual discussion between themselves. The signs of nervousness and fear started to fade from her countenance. The man had a shameless ambition well beyond his worth as a noble. The only thing he seemed to be good at was keeping his deeds beyond Lord Rettenmeier's notice. "Did you know he kept approaching us to break off my engagement to your brother so he could marry me to his second son? What happened to House Volkenheim was House Facet's doing as well. That entire family is rotten to the core. I can just picture him walking proudly into the royal court to make his ridiculous demands. What I would have paid to be there to watch him get tossed out." Clara's gleeful tone was greatly at odds with her usual gentle demeanor. She must have despised the late Count quite a bit. "Knowing this is one looming uncertainty dispelled from all of us," she said. "If the king's justice is not just some thin veneer of order, and he truly intends rule of law for the realm, then we as his nobles will be able to carry out our obligations with confidence. Speaking of which, are our old contracts still valid? What happened between you and the Sorcerer King?" "About that," Ludmilla said, "my title was transferred from His Majesty to Lady Schultier. I'm no longer a direct vassal of the Sorcerer King." "So that's why she was with you the other day," Clara said thoughtfully. "It seems awfully kind of her to accompany a new vassal personally like that. I suppose she's the one that helped you learn so quickly. Still, it's very strange for this to occur. Would you happen to know the reason why?" "I didn't even make it to the audience chamber," Ludmilla replied. "I discovered that she had become my liege after the fact, and I ended up chasing her out the door of the royal villa. Lady Schultier didn't seem to think the reason was something worth sharing with me either. Even in our short time together, I can say that the vassals that accompanied the Sorcerer King to Erantle have a very different way of seeing the world. Perhaps, as we adopt their ways, the reason will come to light on its own." "Perhaps," Clara said, "but what about your contract?" Ludmilla frowned. The absence of the very thing that defined the relationship between liege and vassal was something that bothered her to no end. She had been rationalizing her lack of having one being due to the unknowns that accompanied the state of the new realm, but no matter how reasonable the justifications were, it still felt like there was a piece of herself missing. "I don't have one yet," Ludmilla replied. "Warden's Vale is undergoing major changes and the old contract as a frontier noble of Riestais is most likely obsolete given the strength of His Majesty's armies. It's something I'll have to draft from scratch, and it will probably require several passes before it is acceptable. You will probably have a much easier time writing up your own since your territory is already well established and the expectations should not change much." The one thing I can be almost certain of is that there will be no need for a levy. No levy? Clara brightened. I think it's been mentioned before, but the last week or so has been one giant blur for me. It's a relief to hear it from someone that's been in close contact with a member of the royal court. Having the tenants pulled away to fulfill our obligations every year was quite annoying. I'll ask again to be sure, once I find whoever I need to work with on this. You'll be taking a look at what the new administration has to offer, then? Clara nodded, though her expression still carried a trace of trepidation. I'll head over to the civil office later and see what I can learn there, she said. I'll take Baron Hamel with me as well. He stopped staying over, insisting that he needed to prove his bravery. That's cute. Stubborn is more like it, Clara huffed. He's probably just as scared as I am. I'll drag him out there and make him eat his words.